Observatory. Welcome to this month's Talking Point Tuesday, which we're looking at NICE early assessments. So just a bit of an introduction. So this month we're looking at NICE early assessments. Next month is health economics, April digital health, and May, June and July, you can see them up there. And there's an Eventbrite QR code which takes you straight to the bookings. So feel free to book onto advanced events. So typically on a Talking Point Tuesday, we have networking 9 to 10. 10 to 11 is keynotes with 11 to 11:30 expert panel. So we have, it's kind of more like a fireside chat, so like an informal discussion with questions from the audience. And then at 11:30 to 12, SMEs have the opportunity to dial in to speak to experts and virtual residents, which will be members of the Innovation Observatory team and Newcastle University, and also some of the panel and potentially keynotes. It depends on each event. So we have actually got some available slots for today's one-to-one. So we've had a few bookings, but there are still some more bookings available. So if anyone would like to book onto one of the slots, if you could email IO Events email as per the slide, that would be great. So just in terms of how we support industry, so in terms of our engagement, obviously our main point of engagement is Talking Point Tuesday, the monthly event. But we also have on the website a number of resources. So if you go to the resource page on the Innovation Observatory website, there are a number of reports, research dashboards, technology briefings that are really useful to industry in terms of if you're doing a market assessment, gap analysis, competitor analysis, and you just want some insights around strategy, what's going on in the sector, specifically your subsector, then all of those are public facing and free access. So just go to those on the website. So that's the resources page. So I'm going to hand over now to Becky from NICE, who'll be our next speaker.
Morning, everyone. Do I just flick through this? Are the slides already on? The green one. Oh, that's helpful, because I would have gone the other way. Morning, everyone. So my name's Rebecca Rowans, or Becky, I go by. I'm a technical advisor at NICE, so my role at the moment is sitting 50% of my time is in NICE Advice, so that's the consultancy arm for industry and life sciences, and the other 50% of my time is in the guidance producing team. So hopefully I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour of the early assessments within NICE, setting the context. You'll get more detail later on within this morning, so this is really just a high-level overview of what these early assessments set out to achieve. So I'm going to start by talking about NICE in general and what we aim to do. So NICE as a body is looking to help practitioners and commissioners get the best care to patients, and we want to do that as quickly as possible, but whilst also considering value for the taxpayer. Now there's different ways in which we do this, so I've already explained my two roles. So one of the ways in which we do this is we produce hopefully useful and usable guidance to healthcare practitioners and commissioners about which technologies are going to be the most appropriate for which patient populations and also the best value for money. But we also provide hopefully useful and usable advice to the life sciences industry sector. Now, NICE's approach has changed recently, and I will talk a little bit more about our transition, but we're focusing on what matters most to the patient, and we've put quite a lot of energy now into trying to draw technologies that meet unmet needs within the health and care system. So historically, NICE would accept technologies that came through notifications, and we'd essentially look at them and then select them based on their evidence. That process has changed a bit now, and that's really to ensure that we're selecting technologies and prioritising the technologies that the system needs, so that the system, when they see a NICE recommendation, they know that that's going to have a meaningful impact on the patient population. We also provide rigorous assessments, which again, I'm not going to go into detail because you'll hear more about those later today. But ultimately, all of this is to encourage the uptake of the best practice to improve patient care. So I've mentioned this already a little bit, but NICE is on a transformational journey. I think NICE has been around for a very long time. Our methods are very rigorous, but we do recognise that the health services are changing. The way in which people use technology within the health service is changing. The way in which data is used is changing. And there's an awful lot of pressure on the healthcare system. So to address this, NICE is having to transform too. Now, our core principles remain the same. Our methodologies ultimately remain the same. We're still interested in evidence-based practice, but the ways in which we're going to do that are differing. So, we've heard, we've listened, and what we've heard is that we need to be more timely. We need to be easier to use. I think our website, our guidance needs to be easier. The way that bodies interact with us needs to be easier. We need to be more relevant, so we need to be concentrating on what the most important factors are to the health and care system. And we also need to use the data that's available to us to show how the guidance is producing demonstrable impact. So what does this look like in health tech? This is our new single health tech programme. We've got a life cycle approach, so this is different to what has been previously done by NICE, where we've had different programmes. So you might have heard about the medical technology evaluation programme, the diagnostic assessment programme, interventional procedures programme. These are all now combined into one programme called Health Tech Assessment Programme. We take a life cycle approach now. So you can see here we have the early value assessment, we have multi-medical technology guidance, and we have late stage assessment. And I'm going to point out here, because it's going to change the way that I speak for the rest of this talk, but ultimately the name for early value assessment has just changed. It's out for consultation. We're now going to refer to it as early use assessment. If you really, really dislike that, go ahead and find the consultation, put in a comment, say if you're not keen on it, if you think early value makes more sense. If you really like it, also go ahead. You know, this is a proposal at the moment. But ultimately, and I'll show you on the next slide why this is changing, but the purpose is that early value assessment is looking to draw in medical technologies where there's the potential that they could meet an unmet need within the healthcare system. At NICE, we don't want to be the barrier. We want to be able to engage with industry, and where we see those potential benefits and where we see the need that patients have, we want to draw those in and work with industry and with the healthcare system to make sure that those technologies are used where they are safe to do so and are able to generate the best possible evidence. So I'll talk a little bit more later on about what that means and how we do that, but ultimately that's the purpose of the early value assessment. We want to identify the gaps, find the technologies, pull them through, and then work between the system and with industry to make sure that the evidence being generated is the right evidence that we need to be able to go on for widespread adoption, and so that committee can make the best informed decisions. The other 2 points on this slide, multi-tech and late stage. So multi-tech is now going to be routine use. So that basically means if you've got a technology, you have a substantive evidence base, but you're not yet in widespread use. That's where this standard HGA full assessment comes in. NICE will look at it, we'll do the full rigorous assessment. The committee can then make recommendations on whether or not that should be scaled up and adopted nationally. Late stage use is for technologies that are already in widespread use. So these technologies that, for instance, a catheter already being in widespread use, but there's a lot of variation in price and there's a lot of variation in different features of those types of technologies. So the late stage assessment is purely to look at whether or not those variations in price are justified based on the evidence for the variation in features. This is what we're going to look at today, so that's what I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. But just to clarify what I've said about the name change, this is the transition that you'll see. So you'll have heard about early value assessment, you might have heard about late stage assessment, and you'll be familiar, hopefully, with standard NICE guidance. this is what we're proposing as the new names for those. So an early use assessment for technologies that are early in their product life cycle, routine use guidance for the ones that have these potential benefits but aren't yet being realised. So we want to assess that and see if that's something that should be scaled up, and existing use for the later stage technologies. So this is my first time presenting whilst the name has changed to early use. So I may slip back and forth between early value and early use. So I'm going to apologise straight up for that, but I've tried to change my slides in line with the early use assessment. Just to be clear, they are the same thing. The purpose of an early use assessment, we've already talked about drawing these technologies in where we think that there's a need. We want to map what evidence the technologies already have to understand whether or not they have the potential for benefit. We want to then explore that potential and consider whether or not they're cost effective. Could they be cost effective? What would they need to demonstrate that they're clinically and cost effective? We move into then identifying those gaps and considering, okay, we think that there's promise here, but what do they need in order to demonstrate that? What evidence is missing for the committee to be able to make a full informed decision about whether or not these technologies could be beneficial? The benefits to you, to us, to the system, hopefully quicker and earlier signals to the NHS about technologies that are promising and have the potential to meet needs within the health and care system. Improving evidence quality, and I guess this is referring to the worst case scenario, I guess, within NICE, which I sometimes see, is the technology has gone away, it has potential, but the evidence that's been generated doesn't match with how the NHS system would use it. So perhaps the evidence has been generated in a population that's not relevant to how it would be used in the NHS, or it's being demonstrated within a position in the care pathway which isn't how it would be implemented. And that can really limit the ability for a committee to make a decision about whether that technology is appropriate. And that uncertainty means that more research is needed. Now, the idea here is that you get an early signal to the NHS to say we think there's promise here, but alongside that you're getting information about what evidence you actually need to generate. So to prevent there from being an investment in all of this evidence up front, this evidence generation up front, only to then have to go away and redo it. It's trying to mitigate that risk. This should also hopefully mean earlier access to patients, that patients actually get their hands on these much needed technologies earlier. A clearer pathway to market for industry. I laugh at that because I know how complicated that pathway is for medical technologies. Hopefully, for those really needed technologies, this clears the path. And a collective contribution to system-wide productivity and efficiency. So hopefully collaborating to make sure that patients are getting the technologies they need, the evidence needed to make those bigger, broader decisions of whether or not they should be adopted is being generated, and we all have this set goal of making sure that those unmet needs are met. This is what the process looks like. I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to duplicate what you might hear later, but I'm going to talk about the front end and the back end. So, topics are selected by a prioritisation board. They're identified through topic intelligence processes. So this is, I guess, where we learn about what the system needs. So collaboration with NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, various clinical experts, NIHR, NHS Innovation Service. All of this information is pooled through our topic intelligence team. It then goes to prioritisation board. Now, the topic intelligence team will put together a use case, and so this means a type of technology or a class of technology that will meet the need. An early value assessment is a multiple technology assessment, so any technologies that fall within that remit will be identified through scoping and will then be included into the assessment, provided they are available to the UK market. We then go into the assessment period, which I won't talk much about because you'll hear more about that. But provided that there is a recommendation, and a positive recommendation for an early value assessment is a conditional one. So that means the committee will say that a technology or list of technologies can be used by the NHS during a period of evidence generation, and they will then list what evidence needs to be collected. If that recommendation is positive, you will go on to develop an evidence generation plan. So this is working with the early value assessment team at NICE to develop a pragmatic approach to trying to generate that evidence. Now, we appreciate going away and saying, go away and do a double-blind RCT isn't necessarily appropriate or helpful at this stage. So this step, the evidence generation plan, is to think about approaches that would be appropriate for generating the right quality and quantity of evidence needed for that full recommendation. You then go into a period of evidence generation, so that could be about 3 years. That period will be monitored by NICE to make sure that you are collecting appropriate evidence. You're still engaging with the programme. At the end of that, you'll come back to NICE for a full assessment where we can look at the evidence that's been generated, go back to committee and consider whether a widespread recommendation is appropriate. This is the feasibility assessment, so this is supports the committee's decision making, and ultimately this is for the evidence generation plan. So it will highlight potential barriers to implementation, any undue burden of data collection. It might identify existing registries for data collection. It will also outline the evidence gaps and any potential equality issues. And this is the evidence generation plan. So this is what would come out if you got a positive recommendation. So the evidence gaps would be described and identified, and that would be the NICE committee that would outline what those gaps are. An approach to the evidence generation would then be outlined, so an overview of real-world evidence sources that could support that evidence generation, any potential methodological approaches, bearing in mind that we're trying to be as pragmatic as possible during this process. And then finally, the list of outcomes, and ultimately this is what needs to be collected in order for the proposed study to address the gaps in the evidence and for us to go ahead with the next stage of the assessment. This is where we're up to, or I should say where we're up to as of September 2023, because I've pinched somebody's slide for this because they've not yet rerun the numbers. But you can see just from this slide alone how much has been happening in the early use assessment space. So there's over 100 technologies that have had an evidence generation plan produced for them. A new monitoring process within NICE has been developed, and that's engaging 80 technology developers. The early value assessment team has reviewed 103 responses already about how that evidence is being generated. Feasibility assessments that are informing decision makers around what those evidence generation plans could look like are in use. 7 of the technologies have received funding. Now, it's important to point out at this stage that the evidence generation plan is developed with NICE, but it's not funded. There are opportunities for funding. You can see here that some of the technologies have gone on to receive funding to help them with their evidence generation plans, but typically that's not something that you would get through the early value or early use assessment. And finally, but I've not got the data to show you, I'm afraid, it's still an academic in confidence, but we're starting to identify trends in the evidence gaps in submissions to early value assessment. So later this year you will see publications that start to outline where the biggest evidence gaps typically occur and what people tend to miss when they're generating the evidence, which will hopefully help everybody when you're thinking about evidence generation. So again, this is just some of our successes and challenges that we've seen so far. 80 technology developers are working towards their evidence submissions. The majority are telling us that it's going well, so that's positive. You know, we're hearing good things back from them. I mean, the proof will be in the pudding when everybody comes back for assessments and we start to look at that evidence. But so far, majority seem to think it's going well. Most topics are on track to deliver the evidence that we've outlined. timelines seem to be okay, but again, we're still early in the process, so we'll learn more as time goes on. And as already mentioned, some technologies have already received funding from NIHR or the Office for Life Sciences. Some of the challenges that we're seeing, not everybody is collecting the data. So some technologies, no data has been collected. Already we've spoken that some have got funding, the majority haven't received funding, and they're having to find ways to fund that themselves. So that's a significant challenge. One technology has indicated that they might be able to exit early. Now, whilst that sounds like a good thing, they come as a package with the other technologies that were included in the assessment. And that raises a challenge for us, because if we trigger a full assessment earlier than we'd said, we're not giving the other developers chance in order to finish their evidence generation. If we hold off, are we delaying patient access? So there's a trade-off that needs to be worked through there. It's one of the challenges that we're conscious of. And finally, several technologies have been withdrawn from the process. But to end on a positive note there, it's fewer than we expected. So not all bad. In 2026, we expect 7 exits. Exits here means they finish their evidence generation period and will be cycled back through the NICE assessment process. 2027, another 9. 2028, another 4. So you can see how this early use assessment will then start to fill in to that full HTA assessment programme, and then hopefully, provided that evidence is of sufficient quality and quantity and shows that the technologies are clinically and cost effective, we will see more of those technologies being recommended for widespread use. And just to end, once you've gone from your early use assessment, you move through to routine use. So I'm not going to go through routine use, that's for another day I suppose, but ultimately that's our standard full HTA assessment, where we would do comprehensive assessment of the technology and the cost base. If you go all the way through routine use, you get widely adopted and technology is being used everywhere, you might end up in existing use assessment to make sure that actually within that market there's a good reason for the pricing. I'm just going to talk quickly about any additional services that are available within NICE to industry. So I mentioned at the beginning that we produce NICE guidance, which I've talked about, that's the early use side of this. We also support industry through services, so these are paid for services, but there are some free resources here. So the AI and Digital Regulation Service, that is a free online platform with advice that you can go ahead, search for. It's got lots of information. That's a collaboration between HRA, MHRA, NICE and CQC. So these regulators have come together to provide useful advice to try and help developers navigate the market. We also have our evidence standards. Again, that's for digital, so that's the evidence standards framework. That will outline a series of standards that developers can look to complying with for when you're looking for either going to an HTA assessment or building a business case to take to commissioners. Paid for services, so we have the health system engagement meeting, so this safe harbour meeting where you could, if you're trying to work out your value proposition and you need to understand where exactly the technology fits into the care pathway, or if you want to understand the commissioning pathway further, that's the kind of insights session that could help you. We bring in experts, we'll bring in commissioners, clinical experts, HTA experts to come and talk to you. Scientific advice, so this is if you have a protocol that you want some support with, you want to understand what the best outcomes are, again trying to avoid any mistakes in evidence generation before they happen. And finally, the surgery meeting. So this is, if all of that sounds like a lot, the paid for ones, the surgery meetings are a lighter touch. It's a 1-hour meeting with a NICE advice representative, and we can talk you through the NICE routing, prioritisation processes, any of the guidance programs that you're interested to learn about, we can use that time. So they're just some services that are available through NICE advice. I don't think I really need to talk to you through this slide because we've basically talked about this already, but this is ultimately how that team can help you. I'm going to end there. I'm not going to ask for questions because I realise we've got a Q&A panel at the end, but thank you everybody, and I will hand over. Is that still off, Matt? Oh, I've left my water.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. So my name's Kim Kelty. I am the Centre Manager of the Newcastle External Assessment Group, or EAG, because we love an acronym. And I think today I'm here to talk about we've heard about early value assessment. I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to revert back to the old acronyms, EVAs. But from our perspective, so what happens when you come to a group like ours and have your evidence assessed? So firstly, who are we? So the Newcastle External Assessment Group is a collaboration. This is between medical physics at Newcastle Hospitals and also Newcastle University. We have a diverse staffing group, so we have experts in literature searching, critical appraisal, statistics, real-world evidence analysis, health economics, and a lot of the staff are involved in research as well. Some of our staff are clinical scientists, others are clinical technologists, some have a clinical background, some maintain that clinical role as well. So whilst we're not topic experts for every topic that comes our way, we are health technology assessment experts. And the diverse staffing helps us to deal with all the topics that come our way. In terms of EVAs, we have been involved in 4 topics so far, 2 of which are published, those in bold on that slide there. The third has had its second committee meeting and we're expecting the final recommendations to be published in March. And the 4th one I can't really talk about because it's literally just started and expected to be published in August. So the general process, so we review the clinical and economic evidence for each topic and we support the sort of evidence that's submitted by the companies themselves with our own literature searching. Just to highlight, as Becky's mentioned, we're not expecting complete evidence bases for these technologies. We're expecting to find those gaps, and that's the whole purpose of the EVA, is really to outline what needs to be collected going forward. We may conduct some conceptual early economic modelling, but again, the purpose of that is really to demonstrate what are the key cost drivers, what are the key uncertainties, again, to try and prioritise some of that evidence generation. And the output of the EVA is the evidence generation plan. So that's the whole focus of all of this, is everybody trying to agree what should be collected for that 2 to 3 year period going forward. So these are the 3 topics that we've been involved in so far. So I just wanted to give a summary, just to give you a flavour. Sort of different methodology. There is a process and methods for EVAs going forward. However, there's slight differences in methodology that we have to use depending on the maturity of the technology and the maturity of the evidence base. Prono was the first, and quite an anomaly, it was a single tech EVA. I don't think we're expecting many single tech going forward. The majority is multiple technologies being assessed at the exact same time. Although it was routinely commissioned across all of the cancer services in England, the evidence base for the decision problem wasn't specific enough. So it did go forward and have a recommendation of further evidence generation whilst it was being implemented across England. Digital dye apps is probably the best example that we've been involved with, probably more aligned with what the EVA was originally intended. 8 technologies reviewed at the exact same time, had some clinical evidence, but again, not all generalisable to the decision problem that we were set. Nothing in terms of economic evidence, but we were able to develop a conceptual model to try and, again, direct that future evidence generation. 7 of the technologies went forward for positive evidence generation, and 1 in a research context only. Then the last example, so robotics and orthopaedics, 6 technologies at the same time. All of the technologies were available within the UK. There was a wealth of evidence in this topic area, so we had to actually prioritise some of the comparative evidence because we have a short window to do our assessment. So 26 studies were included, but another 100 were reviewed but not prioritised. There was a wealth of economic evidence as well. There was also economic models available, so we could develop a Markov model and go that a little bit further. The draft recommendations, and I say draft because the final doesn't get released until March, is that 5 of these technologies will go forward for evidence generation and 1 in a research context only. And I suppose this slide just demonstrates the kind of variety in the outcomes that we can have across the EVAs and quite different. So I suppose the practical steps when you get evaluated for an EVA. Approximately 24 weeks long, about 6 months. And yeah, so our assessment really lasts 8 weeks in terms of how we write our report. I would say one of the most vital steps is that scoping workshop starts before the clock starts at the very, very beginning. And that's where NICE gets together, clinical experts, the company and the AAG to kind of go through that scope and really set the decision problem. So what population are we focusing on? Which interventions are similar enough to be included? What are the comparators and what are the outcomes? And it could even be prioritising those outcomes. So if we speak to our experts, where is this going to be implemented? What are the primary outcomes? But really, we need to have that agreed at the start, because when we go to assessment, everything refers back to the generalisability of that evidence to that decision problem. So that's a very key meeting, and the recommendation that the company makes sure they attend that meeting. Following the scoping workshop, the scope will be released. It will also go out with our protocol. So this is a sort of statement of intent of how we intend to do that assessment. At that stage, we've not done literature searching. We've sometimes not received all of the information from the companies, so it's quite high level. But the detail of what we will do in our valuation is in the methods section of our report. So then we go through the evidence. We spend 8 weeks doing so, quite a condensed period of time, and the final report is submitted at the end. During that time, we liaise with a range of stakeholders. So not only are we taking that information that's provided by the companies, but we also speak with NICE throughout that process to make sure that we are following the process and methods guides, we're keeping to timelines, and progress updates, because a lot of the companies will communicate to us through themselves. Experts in the field, so we will speak with clinical experts, lay experts. They're usually advised through professional societies. They recommend some experts that we should be involved throughout that process. We'll talk about the clinical pathway. Where does this technology fit in the NHS? We'll ask them questions regarding the relevance of the evidence. So once we've found the evidence and tabulated, how generalisable is that specific study to the NHS? We can query assumptions in our economic models. We can also go through the parameters of the model if we don't have any data to support that, plausible parameter, confidence intervals, etc. But also the feasibility of that future evidence generation. So if we identify an evidence gap and we propose a study design to answer that, they're ideally placed to say that is suitable within the 2 to 3 year time frame that Becky's just outlined as a requirement of the evidence generation phase. And the companies themselves. So there's a sort of standard form at the start where they can provide information to us. They know the name of the technology, predecessor names, when it went available to market. It's clinical evidence, the economic evidence. But throughout that process, we're asking questions, particularly when it comes to multi-tech, because there's different terminology between the manufacturers. So we may come to you throughout that 8 week period for clarifications, just to make sure that we're treating all those technologies fairly. So what happens next? So the report goes into NICE. NICE then create an overview and a slide deck. So that's really summarising our 200-300 page report into a much easier bite-sized packet of information that then gets released to the committee. At that committee meeting, there will be the AEG and the companies, lay experts, patient experts, clinical experts, public observers also attend that meeting. And that's the opportunity for the committee to read that pack, ask as many questions as they like, and then ultimately reach a decision at the end of that. Draft recommendations will be released alongside the evidence generation plan. And Becky, I think they try to tie both at the exact same. They get released at the same time. And that goes out to public consultation. So again, there's another round of bringing in the experts and the companies to say, you know, this study's just been released after the assessment period, or it's not quite got a piece of information right on my technology. There's another wave of opportunities for them to embed within that process. They collect the consultation comments. It can go back to a second committee discussion, maybe to tweak the wording of that draft recommendations, and then the final recommendations are published, as I say, approximately in a 6-month window. So really what to expect. So there is a process and methods for EVAs, but as Becky's outlined, this is under consultation and being updated, so keep an eye on that. Topic selection has been centralised within NICE, so we might even see that the types of technologies coming our way in terms of EVA production changes slightly. So again, keep an eye on the website. The process is fast, so I say it's 6 months. We only review an 8-week window typically. But again, just to remember, we're reviewing the evidence, looking at that decision problem. So it's very key that we get that decision problem correct at the start. Most EVAs are multi-tech. I think it's very rare that we've had single technology EVAs going forward, and that's definitely direction of travel. So you will have a report, but your competitors will be included in that report as well. Communication goes through NICE, so all of the documentation will be sent to NICE and then transferred to us in a secure drop environment. Committee recommendations can be device specific, but they can also be class based, and that's really the committee's decision to say whether the evidence is close enough that they can treat them as a class instead of individual devices. Information in the public domain helps transparent decision making, and that's really vital for us in terms of developing that report. So the more information that's in the public domain, preprint servers, helps with that decision making. So I would advise making as much of that in the public domain as possible. And the process does vary, so every technology may be treated very slightly differently. It just depends on how far you are through in your technology development and also in your evidence development as well. Lovely. I think that's everything from me. Thanks.
So do I just press the green for the next? Yeah. Excellent, great. Well, hello everybody in the room and online. My name is Steve Rice. I'm a health economist. I'm also the director of the Newcastle Technology Assessment Group. And I'm just going to give a brief presentation on how we can work with companies to develop evidence, including the role of early economic evaluation, in particular early economic modelling. And this relates directly to the early use assessments, the new name that we have. So just to start with, the Newcastle Technology Assessment Group. We're one of the newest technology assessment groups in the country. We were set up in 2022. Across the Health Economics Group and the Evidence Synthesis Group within Newcastle University. Our initial contract runs to 2027, supporting NICE technology appraisals, focusing primarily on drugs and diagnostics. As Kim has already explained, the EAG focuses primarily on medtech. To date, we have delivered 11 technology assessments across a range of conditions and NICE programs, including 1 EVA and 1 diagnostic assessment review. So most of the work we do so far has not been actually in the early evaluation space. But as a group, we have done quite a lot of work as a health economics group. We have done quite a lot of work in the early evaluation space through the EAG and through other research contracts with companies directly. So, I think it's a good place to start with just a very quick explanation of what economic evaluation is. So, here's Economic Evaluation 101. Economic evaluation aims to provide robust information to aid in informing choices. The intention is to ensure that the benefits gained from technologies exceed their opportunity costs within the healthcare system. Economic evaluation is defined as the comparative analysis of alternative courses of action in terms of both their costs and their consequences. But when and where can we use economic evaluation? So we have a technology innovation pipeline. We have a research technology development process, which you can see in the diagram. It ranges from identifying need to development of the technology through to implementation of technologies. Health technology assessments, such as economic evaluation, alongside RCTs, are usually at the implementation stage. So this is where the technologies have been fully developed, they're maturely developed, and you design high quality clinical studies to evaluate the effectiveness of those technologies. And actually that is the late stage assessment. Those are technology assessments in the single technology appraisal process within NICE. But economic modelling can be used to evaluate technologies much earlier in the technology innovation pipeline. Companies can use early economic modelling at different stages of product development and evidence generation. Here I'm focusing on effectiveness, because generally speaking that is the driver of the type of economic evaluation you want to take, although of course the evidence you need within an economic model is varied. So there may be scenarios where there is simply no effectiveness evidence available for a company. There may be, the stage of development of technology may be at a place where the effectiveness estimate, such as it is based on a convenience sample or a pilot study for that technology, which is the lowest quality and of evidence you may have available for effectiveness. And it is highly uncertain that that effectiveness evidence would actually translate to actual effectiveness evidence when evaluated through a randomized controlled trial or a proper diagnostic study. And finally, with the availability of limited quality observational effectiveness evidence. So here we have different levels of effectiveness evidence that might be available during the early stages of technology development and also research. So if a company were to approach us or any other group to undertake an early economic modelling evaluation of a technology, the first thing is an assessment of the technology development stage and the existing research plan. And there needs to be clarity around the goals of what that early economic modelling is trying to achieve. So what are those goals? Well, the main aims of early evaluation are to determine the potential value to the NHS and patients, i.e. is it likely to be cost effective? To determine where that value is likely to be, i.e. thinking about what the product does and where it's placed in the care pathway, and to determine what the key drivers of uncertainty are so that research or development can be focused to aid earlier adoption. Now, the early use assessment that has been discussed so far today, the evidence generation plans relate to generally that final part of the objective, understanding what the key drivers of uncertainty are. And I'll come on to that in more detail in a moment. So early economic modelling helps to answer these following questions. Is there a case for the new technology to be cost effective compared to standard care? Is there a strong signal for the technology not to progress? Within what range of costs and other important performance metrics does the technology need to sit in order for it to be cost effective? So, for example, a company may have early evidence, poor quality evidence on the effectiveness of a technology, and it's trying to work out what price to set for their technology. then they could do threshold analysis around the price to understand at what point, what is the maximum price that you could set your technology to be at for it to be cost effective within cost effectiveness thresholds that we use in the UK, particularly NICE. Alternatively, you may have very, very poor evidence on effectiveness, and you may have an idea of what your cost of or the price of your product is, but you want to understand actually within these ranges, plausible effectiveness ranges that you have for your technology, would it be cost effective? So it also helps to answer what evidence would be required from a full trial in order to move from an early economic valuation to a full one. By full trial, read clinical study, because the study design will be specific to what your technology is. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard across most technologies, including diagnostic and predictive tests. However, especially for diagnostic tests, and even potentially predictive tests, but mostly diagnostic tests, sometimes there is some clinical study designs that are not randomized controlled trials are accepted. It also helps to answer what further research is required and what is the appropriate design of further clinical studies. So one of the benefits of early economic modelling is to develop a framework for evaluating the cost effectiveness of that technology. You're trying to identify all the evidence that you would need to evaluate the cost effectiveness, and you may not have that evidence. And that is where the evidence gaps come in that were referred to earlier in this discussion. It's not just effectiveness, it could be the quality of life of patients, which is extremely important. It could be the long-term effectiveness of long-term outcomes of technologies. It could be resource use. It could be any number of parameters. But having an early economic model framework, it gives you a framework to evaluate what evidence you need in order to evaluate the cost effectiveness of your technology. And you'll be able to work out, develop a research plan in order to fill in those evidence gaps, which the model is giving you guidance for. So early economic modelling typically includes discussion of the value proposition, and by that I mean what are the benefits of the technology, a brief review of existing literature and a rapid evidence synthesis, a care pathway analysis. A simplified decision analytic model is then developed, but actually the design of that model will depend on the maturity of the data and the evidence that you have available. And if needed, a value information analysis to guide further research. But in an early economic model context, that value of information analysis is probably most likely to be a simple form of value information analysis, where you're looking at ranges, plausible ranges of evidence, parameter evidence for your model. So the information, generally speaking, well, there's quite a thorough list here of information required for a technology to be adopted within the NHS. You need a clear place in the care pathway. There needs to be consensus on the use and implementation of the technology. What I mean by that is, so if you have, say, an implantable heart device to monitor the health of your heart with remote monitoring, or if you have repeatable home use diagnostic tests, then what needs to be in place in order to, within the NHS, in order to enable the implementation of that technology to take place? How is that information going to be processed and reviewed by healthcare staff in a hospital? What is the frequency of clinic visits going to be if you have that diagnostic technology in place? So all of these implementation issues around not just the technology itself, but actually how it's incorporated within the healthcare system. A clear statement of the value proposition, a demonstration of effectiveness, and a demonstration of favourable risk and benefit profile. What I mean by that is adverse, the relationship between the benefits and the adverse effects potentially related to the technology. So in the approval process of technologies, you obviously need to demonstrate that they are safe, but some technologies do come with a risk profile. But that if it does come with a risk profile, then you need to demonstrate that the benefits of that technology clearly outweigh those risks. And a demonstration of cost effectiveness and an understanding of the impact on equity and the utilisation of that technology within different populations. Early economic modelling will review all of these. All of these need to be reviewed when conducting early economic modelling. So back to us as a group, we are I'm the Director of Technology Assessment Group at Newcastle, but we are part of the Health Economics Group. We undertake early value assessments for NICE, although that is a minority of what we do. Typically, as has already been explained, these are multi-technology assessments, so they will incorporate multiple technologies that will already in use or want to be compared at the same time. But companies can commission their own early economic models to evaluate their own technologies to help them develop their research plans and to generate the evidence required for adoption in the NHS. And we, as a Health Economics Group more broadly, undertake early economic modelling for companies in-house and in collaboration with the NHR Newcastle In Vitro Diagnostics Cooperative. Thank you.
Hi, so we're just moving on to the expert panel session and kind of the fireside chat. So if anyone's got any questions, then we'll take them from the audience. And we've also got some questions online from the dial-in group. So we're joined on the panel by Gurdeep and Ryan, two colleagues from Newcastle University and the Innovation Observatory. So if you just introduce yourselves and say what your role is in the IO on Newcastle. So Gurdeep.
My name is Gurdeep Sagu. I'm a senior lecturer in health economics and I co-lead the health economics group at Newcastle University.
That's Gurdeep. Ryan.
And I'm Ryan Kenny. I'm a research associate as part of the Evidence Synthesis Group and the Innovation Observatory. I've worked together with Kim on the EEG projects and with Stephen Gurdeep as part of the TARS projects as well.
Thank you. So has anyone in the audience got any questions from any of the presentations or to the members of the team that have joined the panel? Yeah, I can see a hand up already. Just bring a mic.
Thank you for your presentation. In terms of thinking about early engagements and company strategies and whatnot, should a company not get prioritised, does that automatically default them to bottom of the pile?
No, so does it? Oh yeah, it works. I was going to pinch your microphone. No, so it doesn't default you to the bottom of the pile. So I guess the NICE have this prioritisation process, and it has a forward view. So you'll find online the annual forward view, and that's considered each year as to what the priorities that we need to focus on are. If a technology isn't selected, whether it's because it doesn't fit within one of those prioritised boxes or for another reason, it will come back for review. So it's not that it sits at the bottom of the pile and is forgotten about. It's just that NICE can only take on so much work at any one point. And so they have to make decisions about which pieces of work to progress. Anything that isn't selected, so all of the reasons will be published online anyway. So the outcome of the prioritisation board will be published. It might be that there's recommendations to engage elsewhere during that period, or it could just be that actually something else has been selected in the meantime, but this will come back for review in however many months' time. So it's not to the bottom of the pile, but we do have to be considerate about what's being selected when and align that with NHS priorities and policy-making priorities.
Sorry, Sharon.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that was really very interesting. I've just got a couple of questions. The first one is for Stephen. I was very interested in your presentation. One of the points that you made around that, how you're using those evidence reviews and also as well looking at those early economic modelling. And you talked about being able to provide advice around or providing signals to stop something. I was just wondering if you could just expand a little bit on that, on where those signals come from and what does that actually mean? Was that something that you'd be informing someone who's developing a technology to actually say, you know, it's probably not worth taking this further forward? I'm just trying to understand what that signal to stop actually means.
Yes, so I can give you a couple of examples. One example would be you've done some early research in the diagnostic accuracy of a diagnostic test, and the sensitivity and specificity of that test are not as high as maybe you initially hoping it would be, and you plug your data into an early economic model, and the cost effectiveness maybe the cost effectiveness rate, incremental cost effectiveness ratio might just be too high because it's not quite effective, sufficiently as effective as you were hoping it would be. So that evidence could guide you towards whether, I mean, we're talking, this is normally in the early development of a technology, really. So this is during the development stage, rather than you've got a fully developed diagnostic test with a rigorous assessment of its sensitivity and specificity. So, so I've worked on projects with companies where the diagnostic accuracy has not been as high as they were expecting, and this is still during the development stage, and the cost effectiveness results have indicated that, you know, given the thresholds and what have you that we have in this country, that it was unlikely that it would be cost effective going forward. And that's not the sole decision, it's not the sole piece of information that a company would use to inform whether or not to carry on the development of but it can help. It's one piece of the puzzle, it's one piece of the jigsaw. Another example I can give is thread technology for treating a condition called chronic lung allograft dysfunction after lung transplantation. And there's actually a trial ongoing to evaluate the effectiveness of that device that treats that disease. Now, there's a contract in place with the company for a follow-up study, a long-term study to collect longer-term data on the outcomes of that technology. But there's actually a stop-go decision in our contract. So if actually the effectiveness evidence is not sufficiently promising from the initial clinical study, then they won't go ahead and finance the follow-up longer-term study. And that's both, again, it's not just the economics, but it's a combination of the effectiveness and the cost-effectiveness evidence that they would use to help them inform whether to continue with that further research.
That's great. Thank you very much. Just one more. Just a quick question for Rebecca. So around the funding, obviously the NIHR OLS Real Evaluation Core funded seven of those projects, and those companies who are going through the EVA program and who've had that evidence gap analysis done as well. What's your view or position on those companies then using that sort of almost badge with other or it could be with NIHR, but with other funders as well, to say that that they're on this program, you've done this analysis. Here's the gaps, and we're going to submit a grant application now to fund some of that work, because, like as you say, NICE isn't funding any of this, so these companies and developers need to go out there and proactively find that funding to support those studies to be able to fill those gaps as well. So I'm just interested to know whether those companies are proactively using their position within the program to be able to try and secure funding to support some of those studies.
Yeah. The short answer to that is yes, they absolutely are, and the evidence generation plan gives a really good outline of what is needed and how to achieve that and the purpose of that evidence generation. And so I absolutely see that the companies are using that in order to try and obtain funding, because it's not the expectation that companies are, okay, well, here's your evidence generation plan, you have to go and fund this for yourselves now, we don't think you should get any help. It's just that we're not able to provide that funding. But absolutely, you can use that package of information that has been rigorously gone through and considered by committee to help secure that funding so that you can achieve, because ultimately what we all want is for the best available evidence to be generated.
Hi. Question for Rebecca. If you're quite deep into your evidence generation already, and maybe waiting for some studies to be published in the next couple of years, you've already got some published, but you haven't engaged with NICE through the early value assessment programme, would I be right in picking up there that you would then kind of skip that process and then go on to the routine use guidance programme if you felt that high quality, good enough evidence had been generated?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. When we talk about that product life cycle approach and we start with the early value, I've obviously focused on that today because that's the perspective, but you could just come straight in at the routine use. So if you've gone away and you've, for instance, not been prioritised at that earlier stage, but actually you are developing something, you've got a substantive evidence base, you can be picked up at NICE and go straight into routine assessment.
Yeah,
and
when you say picked up, do you pick us up or do we come to you?
It's a bit of both, but ultimately it's a we pick you up. So I guess an important distinction is you can register your technology on the NHS Innovation Service, and I would recommend that everybody does that because it will give you the best possible opportunities with a range of stakeholders and system partners. But we at NICE will also see that will go into topic intelligence. But ultimately, the topic suggestions come from a range of sources and are led by system demand. And it's important to point out as well that if an assessment topic is selected and your technology has the potential to meet that need, or for instance, you know, we're considering for routine use. You can't quite opt out, so the technology will be included into the assessment. You don't have to engage with us, you don't have to cooperate. We would recommend that you do engage and cooperate, but just because you're not choosing to cooperate wouldn't mean you weren't included in the assessment. So the assessment will include all of the relevant technologies within the scope based on what is publicly available for that technology. So if you're available within the UK market and you fall within scope, I would recommend that you do engage with NICE, you know, cooperate with the external assessment group, but ultimately it is a case of we will be assessing those technologies.
That's great, thanks.
Can I just add a little thing, something like a little tag onto that? So from an evidence generation point of view, when we start doing that evidence generation, and Becky said, like, for the companies needed to engage, it's really important for us, because if you've got unpublished stuff, we will only get that if you engage with the process. So if you've got like a massive RCT that's not published yet and it's confidential, you can then, obviously if you engage with the process, we get that information, that goes into our report, that makes your technology have a better evidence base. So it's really important for us and you guys that you engage within that process, because it just makes our jobs easier. It makes your guys' jobs easier because you're getting more evidence within that as well. So you're getting more bang for your buck essentially in terms of what you're doing. So I just wanted to add on to that from our point of view.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I've got a question. I don't know whether it's to Kim or to Rebecca, but for context, I work with a consultancy firm that supports pharmaceutical companies with market access as well as HTA submissions, and we do get involved in the process, in the whole life cycle from end to end. One of the things you talked about was around the scoping workshop, which is very important in setting the scene and the PICOs, and I just wondered with regards to MedTech, whether there is any scope for the involvement of patient advocacy groups, because we do get quite a lot of that with pharma and with medicines, but with MedTech, is there any scope to get them involved in that scoping workshop, particularly with helping to capture some of those more qualitative evidence that are not published or or that are not captured in a way you will do in medicines. So I'm not sure whether it's to yourself, Kim.
I mean, I can start and then hand over to yourself. I mean, certainly it should be. That scope and workshop is vital, and I think we've pushed for that in several cases, in terms of prioritising the outcomes, what population, what interventions, and it's really that unmet need. And again, that comes from this is all about trying to get the best outcomes for our patients and the quickest access. And I think NICE have tried to be reactive to try and implement that more in MedTech, but maybe Becky wants to kind of comment on that more.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So in the scoping workshops especially, we really want the patient voice. It can be difficult to find the right patient populations, especially at that stage when you're still scoping, so you've not necessarily nailed down the population, but we are desperately trying to bring in more patient voices. You'll see in the late stage assessments, we're trying to do more to bring in that patient voice. We've got more user-centered work that's going into each one of those. So we are trying to draw it in, and especially with early value assessment where we're so dependent on their need, and trying to make sure that whatever technologies we're producing guidance on and producing recommendations for are going to meet the needs. It is essential, but it's not necessarily always an easy challenge to meet. But it is right up there as a priority.
For Becky. So
busy today.
Yeah, thank you, sorry. Basically, my question is a little bit more general with the changes that NICE have implemented over the last year. So I work for MedTech Consulting, and we deal with regulatory UKCA, CE, FDA, but we also do market access. So we come across a wide range of really unique, innovative type devices. So with the changes, and I noticed that one of your first slides was more relevant, and I was thinking, I wonder if NICE are making themselves less relevant. but I'm feeling I'm getting it now. It's more relevant to our policies over here in the UK. You've got your nice forward view. Those are big topics when I looked at those. You know, got mental health, cancer, to name a couple. But I'm still sat wondering, with some of these SMEs that we deal with, and they come to us and they're wanting to engage with NICE, and because of that change, I'm sat there thinking, an example, I spoke to a CEO about a week ago on the west coast of America, really innovative device for hydration, and it would probably fit really nicely in for kidney disease or something, or care of the elderly, right? And I'm sat there thinking there is never going to be a big priority for where that would fit, and I was thinking there might be a lot of smaller, unique medical devices that you'll never see. And actually, this is not a criticism at all. It's just trying to understand, is that movement, I guess, on purpose to make sure that we are hitting the big, heart disease, whatever, topics, rather than there's a lot that maybe will never make it to a NICE review?
Yeah, and it's a difficult question to answer, but it's a good one to ask. And I think you're right, it is an intentional move towards system demand, and we say more relevant, and when I'm saying more relevant, I mean specifically to the big hitters in the NHS, because I think you could look at every single corner of the NHS and there will be a need. It's under such strain and such pressure that you don't have to go far to speak to. I've yet to meet a clinical expert that says, no, there's no need here, we're fine, we couldn't benefit from anything. Do you know what I mean? That no matter what corner you look to in the NHS, there will be a need. So to try and prioritise the NICE workload and, have the biggest impact for the NHS and for the population, for the patients, we're trying to align closer to those big needs. And you're right, that does end up, I guess, previously what we'd done is we would have a notification system, and anything that looked innovative would come through our path. And I think the feedback that we were hearing was, this is great, these bits of guidance, but they're not having a large enough impact on the whole NHS. So they're asking us to prioritise these workloads. It doesn't mean to say that those sorts of technologies would never come through NICE, but it does mean that, especially in the immediate future, we are concentrating on the big hitters.
And just to confirm as well, the MIBs, will those smaller companies potentially be able to do those still?
No, so we no longer have medical technology innovation briefings. I think the earliest would be the early value assessment or the early use assessment. That's what you'd see. And again, that is based on system demand, and that's just from feedback that we've heard that's driven that transformation.
I think the feedback back to companies, though, is we'll watch the EVAs, see what the outcomes are, see what the recommendations in terms of evidence generation, because there are some themes. I mean, you say something's coming later in the year. And really it's about that unmet need. So in the NHS, if you've got a technology, how is it going to be implemented? What's the pathway? How's that all going to flow from that? You'll learn a lot from watching what's happening going through that EVA process.
Yeah, that's really good advice, actually. If you're unsure about anything at all, go and find some of these early value assessments and read through the committee discussions and the assessments and the evidence generation plans, and you're right, you will see trends and you will see typical things, and that will inform your ways forward, just in case you're unsure about how to progress.
We're just going to take some online questions, because obviously we've got virtual attendees as well.
Yeah, is my mic working?
Yeah.
I'm mic, so it should be.
There you go.
I'll just talk loudly if you can't hear me. So Anik from Vivan Therapeutics has said, we are a startup and we are developing a digital clinical decision support tool for cancer patients that recommends effective treatment options based on a patient's tumour genetic profile. We don't have any regulatory approval, CE marking, etc. yet, and are in the process of planning our first clinical trial. At what stage would be a good point to contact NICE for EVA?
So shall I answer that one? So I guess, again, this comes back to that system demand point, and if they've got their innovation service record, so I would absolutely recommend that they complete an NHS Innovation Service record, keep that up to date because that's a live record essentially that they can keep populating. In terms of when would NICE start to become interested in technology like that, they fit one of the big hitters. Really what we need is for them to have a UKCA or a CE mark. So ultimately we can't recommend any products within the NHS if the NHS doesn't have access to them. So, you know, from their perspective, keep working towards your regulatory conformity assessment, keep up with your trial, keep your NHS Innovation Service record up to date, and that use case will be developed in Target Intelligence as those technologies become available to the NHS. It might not be straight away because there might be other priorities, but it's certainly one of the avenues into NICE that the team keeps an eye on.
Yeah, just to add to that, because again, the output of the EVA is the evidence generation plan. So what you really want is a technology who's implemented, used somewhere in the UK, because the minute that report is published, there is a 3-year ticking timer. So you really want to be able to collect that data, because NICE will be monitoring the kind of outputs of that as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got another one from Dr. Campbell. We've tried to engage with EVA team before, but we were told that NICE does not accept requests from SMEs per se. Our worry is rare diseases, e.g. brain cancer, might not be flagged for NICE review, evidence gap likely to be larger in small sample size in such cases. How can we, as a company, collaborate with NICE in such situations?
Okay, so there is a mechanism where we don't request suggestions from industry directly, but they could talk to, if they've got clinical experts that are supporting the technology, they're engaging with sites already, getting NHS Trust on site, they could talk to clinical experts, and if they're really interested in that technology and there is that unmet need, then clinical experts, healthcare practitioners can suggest a recommendation on the NICE website. So I think there's forward view. So there is a route through which that they can put that forward, but they need to be engaging with the NHS and have sites and healthcare practitioners on site.
Thank you. I think we've got some more. 2 seconds. It would be great to know in more depth why there were challenges with several technologies such as virtual wards and AI contouring. For example, virtual wards are in use around the UK within the NHS, and there have been various publications citing their positive outcomes. Why has it been difficult to collect data?
So I'll have to take that one back to the EVA team and find out more specifically about the company. So it might be worth whoever's put that question on, if you want to put them in contact with me, and then I can take that away.
I will do.
As much as I have at the moment is the general overview of some companies have really struggled to get funding and others are struggling with their data collection. They're the main threads, but I can't talk specifically to each of the companies.
Another one, what is the cost for digital health companies who would like an early value assessment to be done for their technologies?
So there's no fee for an early value assessment or a early use assessment. The cost would really come from, I guess, resource time and burden. So in order to be engaging in the process, there'd be meetings to attend, there'd be a request for information form, so it's not a full dossier or anything, but there would be information that we would be requesting from the companies, and a lot of back and forth, which Kim's able to talk more about. But there is a lot of, during the 6 months, there's a lot of engagement with. So it's more the cost of resource to the company rather than any kind of financial upfront cost.
Which organisation is best placed to support startups and SMEs with economic modelling?
Well, a company could approach us at Health Economics Group. They could approach the Newcastle NIHR in vitro diagnostics group, if I've got the name right. I keep forgetting the exact name. It may have changed the name, in fact. Sorry, apologies. The name has changed a couple of times. But we have a group here at Newcastle, whatever the most recent name is, who have done a lot of work for small and medium-sized companies in helping them develop their do early economic modelling and even later stage economic evaluation. So we can provide the contact details somehow later.
The RSS and the HRC.
We can provide
Yeah.
a selection of contact details of ways to get advice
Yeah.
on. So the RSS is actually just advice on how to put together grant applications.
Yeah.
So we provide. There are groups to provide advice on developing research plans and grant applications, but there are also groups who can also actually help undertake that work.
Yeah.
So So how should we do that? It's just
I think if people go to the Innovation Observatory website on the industry page, it's got all of the links anyway. So it's kind of using those resources and tools, partners who we work with. And then when the slides go out, we can just put a note in for the Research Support Service, which I'm the Newcastle industry lead for the Research Support Service. So if anyone wanted kind of NIHR funding advice, that would be through me. And then we just work really closely with the HRC nationally as well, so I can signpost people into that. So it's probably easier if I just do it kind of on an individual basis, just to see what they want and need. So yeah, I can pick that up.
Can I also signpost the NICE advice as another route in to other organisations that might be able to point you in the right direction as well?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
thanks, Kim.
Is there any more questions in the audience?
I think someone did have one in the audience. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I think this is possibly one for the health economics. So just thinking about a company considering the feasibility of launching in the UK for a rare disease. Data's limited, some small phase 1-2 studies. Do you have any examples where you know some alternative data analysis has been accepted through the NICE process, you know, at that early stage, so thinking of Bayesian modelling or something like that? Have you seen, or surrogate endpoints? Haven't had time to read the new module yet, sorry, but yeah, any examples there to help with that decision making for, you know, for a company?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and really topical, because within Newcastle we have very recently, so within the last year, been funded by LifeArc to set up a rare diseases trials accelerator platform. And the intention of that is exactly to do what you've said. So we don't have any examples at the moment, but we will be employing novel methods to think about the evidence generation pathway and thinking about how we use different methods, not only on the effectiveness side, but also the cost effectiveness side as well, and working with companies. So Professor Dave Jones, Newcastle University, leads that on our behalf here at Newcastle, but Professor James Wason is the stats lead, and I'm the health economics lead for that. So yeah, if you want us to look at anything in particular,
Yeah,
please
thank you.
do get in touch.
And in terms of other study designs, again, just a point, I feel like a nice rep today, the real-world evidence framework as well, so there is other opportunities of other types of data to be involved, and it gives really great guidance, actually, as to what the expectations would be, so that's maybe worth a read as well.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentations. I do have a question for Rebecca. You did mention that you do not do evaluation for technologies that do not have the CE mark, but that seems like a very risky, I guess, endeavor for many SMEs where they might spend 10 years or more developing a technology, going through design, development, manufacture, clinical trials or clinical evaluation in order to get the CE mark, and then it might not get approved or recommended by NICE. Is there some mechanisms perhaps to de-risk the journey for small manufacturers or small SMEs?
So I think so. The purpose of this is so you can't sell to the UK market without a CE mark or a UKCA mark. So I guess you can't really de-risk it from the perspective of if you wanted your technology to be used in the UK, you have to have that conformity assessment. If you're choosing UK as a market, that's your first hurdle really, is to come in, engage with MHRA, the approved bodies, notified bodies, and to get over that safety hurdle. You can stagger your evidence generation so that actually you're generating your evidence for safety first and addressing those standards, and then, provided that you get your conformity assessment for the UK, you can go on to generate your further evidence for clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. I would urge anybody that is, taking that approach to when you're generating your plans for how you're going to demonstrate safety, also consider if you can capitalise on that for any health technology assessment outcomes. So you're not having to, do more, like duplicate efforts when actually you could have engaged all in one. But ultimately, from a NICE perspective, there's no point in us assessing technologies if they're not going to come to the UK market, because ultimately we're providing national guidance to the UK NHS system about, to the practitioners and commissioners around which technologies to use. So for us to look at a technology that then might not come to the UK is a big waste of resource, and it just won't make sense to the users of our guidance, because they need to know that actually the technologies that we're recommending are available to them.
So in that case, you mentioned also about the commonalities in the gaps of the evidence generated by companies. Perhaps the guidance that you're hoping to publish, is there a means maybe of that you could use to for the guidance to be implemented by MHRA maybe, or recommended to the manufacturers to consider earlier?
I think so. So what you'll see is that there'll be data published around what the trends are, but I think typically we can say, you need to make sure that when you're developing your evidence generation, you're aware of your value proposition, which I think we've heard about already, and that's understanding exactly where your technology fits within the care pathway and what benefits patients and the healthcare system stand to gain. Now that value proposition will ultimately underpin a decision problem. You can look at any one of the NICE scopes and they'll have a decision problem table that will outline population, intervention, comparator and outcomes. Ultimately, the key to good evidence generation is making sure that your evidence, your population, intervention, comparator and outcomes all aligns with your value proposition, and it's all relevant to the UK, because that's where we're trying to generalise the data to. So if you follow those general principles, you're going to be generating good evidence. Sometimes understanding exactly what the value proposition is, how it fits within the care pathway, which population stands to gain the most, they can be difficult elements to understand. And we have, within NICE Advice, we have services that can help people get there. But ultimately, having that really good understanding of your PICO, your population, intervention, comparator and outcomes, that's where you'll be able to then generate really good information. And, when the EAG are assessing the evidence, that's what they're assessing it against. It's that decision problem. And that links back to the value proposition of your technology and making sure that that value proposition aligns with the unmet need that NICE is trying to identify a technology to fit the gap. So did that help?
I think so. I'll come to speak to you later, if that's right.
Can I just follow up on that? So So the PICO is the most important thing, but you can do your own early economic evaluation to sort of predict how you would fare, you know, if you were to ever submit within the process. If assessments have been done within NICE in a space relevant to you, then you can learn from looking at those assessments and the factors that have been included in those assessments, etc., to learn about how you would, if you were to go through an evaluation through NICE, what would be required, and what evidence and factors you would need to consider. So there are, yeah.
Just time for one more question.
Yeah, it's just a quick follow-up to the question around having like a streamlined kind of pathway to get, you know, from regulatory to licensing and then to access. I know with medicines there's the ILAP, which has been refreshed now, ILAP 2.0. Is there a similar pathway for medtech? I know there was IDAP a few years ago, but is it still?
So the Innovative Devices Access Pathway, so that's IDAP that you referred to. Yeah, so that is essentially the medtech equivalent of ILAP. It's obviously a little bit different because it's tailored to medical devices. That has just run a pilot phase for the last 12 months. That pilot phase is due to end in March. So 8 technologies have been through that IDAP and they've received the support. And it's an advisory pathway. So ultimately, you have MHRA, NICE, the equivalent HTA bodies from Wales and Scotland, that's Scottish Health Technology Group, Health Technology Wales, NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, coming together to give companies joined up advice around how to get through the regulatory barriers, what to prepare for an HTA assessment, what they need to consider in terms of later adoption down the line. So we've been, for the last 12, 18 months, we've been delivering that pilot for those 8 technologies. We're now in an evaluation phase of that pilot where we're taking lessons learned, we're considering how valuable have these tools been that have been delivered through IDAP, how can we improve them? Ultimately, we're sat in that position where we're waiting to learn if there's going to be future funding to launch that kind of pathway. But ultimately, you're right, there's the IDAP, which sits right upstream of the HTA evaluation. That's for companies that don't yet have their regulatory marking within the UK, but they're looking to get it and trying to help them capitalise on that evidence generation for safety to make sure that actually if there's quick wins where they can also get some HTA outcomes within that evidence package, great, we can help you work out where that might happen. We can help you with your trial design through scientific advice. We can help you work out value proposition, commissioning pathways. NHS England can help you with your road to adoption. So it's really a supportive package for those technologies that have the potential to meet unmet need. Hopefully, those technologies will get their conformity assessment, enter the UK market, and come through an early use assessment to further that evidence generation pathway. All of that is yet to come to fruition because we don't know if it will launch. It's, you know, dependent on funding.
Thank you. Thank you everyone on the panel and keynotes, and obviously the audience for attending. That was really helpful, really useful, some really good questions there, so thank you. Any follow-ups, just email us on the Insights events email that was on the slides, and the slides will be circulated afterwards as well for contact details. So thank you.